Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Hope you are all well. This is your host, Danny Dhaiphong. As you can see, I am joined by two special guests. It's actually been basically 2 years since I've had both of these friends of the show on the program. With me today is frequent guest Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer. And we have joining from Cairo, Egypt, Dan Kovalik, human rights lawyer, author, analyst, activist. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, man. You forgot with Dan Kovalik's all-around good guy. You got to put that in there.
Thank you. I should say that about you, Scott. Thank you.
Yes, and a stalwart.
You are.
Dan Kovalik, yes, a stalwart for peace. And he's actually the author. So I have both books because Scott and Dan are both prolific authors. Scott's new book, which we have covered here, is in the video description. Dan Kovalik's new book, The Case for Palestine, can be found in the video description below from Skyhorse Publishing Hot Books. And I do encourage you all to check that out and be sure to support their work. Everyone hit the like button. We are about to get started because that helps boost the stream in the algorithm. But gentlemen, we have a lot to get to, so let us get started. Benjamin Netanyahu's very dramatic visit to Congress has now essentially come and gone. He gave a fiery speech, as the Western mainstream media is calling it. Now, I wanted to ask, and we can start with Scott as I play this video, about the myths and the realities here. What is the reality of what is actually happening on the ground in Gaza and Israel's continued onslaught? It's a so-called military operation, it's genocide. Because the very first words that came out of Netanyahu's mouth was regional war. This is what he had to say. These were literally the first points he made coming out in Congress had to do with coming together around the regional threats. So here we go. I just want to play it really quick.
Officially become Iran's useful idiots.
Ooh, sorry, that's the wrong video. This is actually, hold on one second. I want to get to that in a bit, but here is Netanyahu, the very first things that came out of his mouth.
The world is in upheaval. In the Middle East, Iran's axis of terror confronts America, Israel, and our Arab friends. This is not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash between barbarism and civilization. It's a clash between those who glorify death and those who sanctify life. For the forces of civilization to triumph, America and Israel must stand together.
So if we had, if we were doing a drinking game, and the amount of times that Netanyahu was applauded, we had to take a shot, we would be incredibly drunk, probably hospitalized. But he said after that, that when America and Israel stand together, we win. Scott, can you start just reacting to the speech and to the realities that maybe Netanyahu did not cover?
Well, he actually got the realities pretty good, except you got to flip the script. It is this clash between barbarism and civilization, and but the barbarians are the Israelis, Zionism. The International Court of Justice has determined that Israel is an apartheid state. The International Criminal Court has sought arrest warrants for Bibi Netanyahu for being a practitioner of genocide. I mean, we're beyond speculation here. He is truly one of the most evil men that have, alive today, and probably he's in the top 10 of the most evil men of the past century. And there was a lot of evil guys in the last century. So he's basically taking ground truth and just flipping it. It's a PR campaign. It is a regional war. There's no doubt about it. The axis of resistance, it's not an axis of evil, it's an axis of resistance to Israel, the apartheid state, the practitioners of genocide, backed by their American allies. The axis of resistance is doing its job and doing it damn well, and kicking the snot out of Israel. Israel's not winning. America's not winning. I just want to remind everybody that the Eisenhower Carrier Battle Group had to withdraw, having not completed its assigned task of breaking the Houthi blockade of Israel's southern ports. The Houthi have gotten stronger, empowered, blowing up some in a fire and fury light show, blowing up some oil containers. It didn't accomplish anything. The Houthi continued to sink ships, attack ships, enforce the blockade. And it probably triggered events. We have the Russians signing a secret military agreement with Iran. And I bet you there's a classified annex that has Russia providing Iran with some very capable anti-ship missiles and ballistic missiles, which Iran will then provide to the Houthi, keeping Putin's promise to wage asymmetrical warfare against the United States and its allies by providing weapons to forces hostile to the United States and its allies, so that they could be struck in a way that Russia's been struck by Ukraine, using weapons provided by the United States and NATO. I think that's the future of Israel. This was a pathetic speech. We'll get in. You sort of gave a hint, so I don't want to jump ahead. How pathetic this was, not just in terms of Netanyahu, but the American representatives there. This man should never have been allowed in the people's house. This man should never have been allowed in our country. This man is a disgusting warmonger. I'm not a big fan of Ms. Tlaib, but she's 100% right. He's a war criminal. and he's a practitioner of genocide. And I applaud her for having the courage to hold that sign up during this ridiculous display of submission. I mean, if you ever wanted proof positive that the United States Congress was bought and paid for by Israel, there it was. But I think Dan might have some things to say on this too.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, Scott. I think the thing to start with is what you started with, and that is that Netanyahu got it exactly reversed. When he talks about barbarism and versus people who care about the sanctity of life, it is the Israelis who are violating the sanctity of life in such a big way in Gaza that is heartbreaking. I'm in Egypt now. I'm with a legal team. We're going to take testimony, and we have been, of Palestinians, refugees here in Egypt. There's about 100,000 here in Egypt that have fled the war in Gaza. Many more would have, but sadly, Egypt is also a party to this war, and they're on the wrong side. And they have charged people around $5,000 to $6,000 a head to come into this country, which is shameful. And of course, no one can come in now because the Rafah crossing between Egypt and Israel has been closed by Israel since May 7th, almost 3 months. No humanitarian aid is getting in, and no human beings are getting out of that crossing, which is stunning. Gaza is now in the midst of a full-blown famine, which is human-caused, which the Israelis caused. They tried to cause. According to Lancet, I'm sure you've talked about this on the show, at least 186,000 Palestinians have died in this conflict to date. I think it's probably more than that. And you're going to see many, many more because of the starvation and disease, right? Polio is now spreading in Gaza. They have found polio in the water system, meaning that people are contracting polio. Israel is inoculating its soldiers against it, of course, not the Palestinians. And this is all by design. They want to kill the Palestinians. That's why this is a genocide. And it's heartbreaking. And my own perception and my own anecdotal evidence is that the hate that's discussed is really one way. The Israelis hate the Palestinians. Obviously, there's some Israelis who don't, and God bless them. But that number's shrinking all the time. But I don't meet Palestinians that hate the Israelis, though they hate the occupation, they hate the genocide. But the hate towards the Palestinians is on a scale. I've never seen that type of hatred in my life. And so again, when you talk about the first forces of darkness and light, Israel is not part of the light. The U.S. is not part of the light. And we have to start from that premise.
Yeah, and as this speech was going on, Israel was and is, I mean, always is, every single day, killing Palestinians, murdering Palestinians in large numbers. Dozens and dozens and dozens per day, at least from what we know of on the so-called battlefield, which is mainly targeting civilians. But I wanted to play this another clip from Netanyahu because, Scott, you've talked a lot about the kind of realities on the ground in terms of how Israel is doing with regard to the war. I noticed that Netanyahu is very concerned about trying to paint Israel as protecting civilians. I mean, here's what he had to say about Rafah.
I asked the commander there, how many terrorists did you take out in Rafah? He gave me an exact number, 1,203. I asked him, how many civilians were killed? He said, Prime Minister, practically none, with the exception of a single incident where shrapnel from a bomb hit a Hamas weapons depot and unintentionally killed 24 people. The answer is practically none. You want to know why? Because Israel got the civilians out of harm's way, something people said we could never do. Well,
So I noticed in this speech he talked a lot about things like this, about how Israel is actually doing good in Gaza, protecting civilians. But also there's this reality that, as most people know in the world, that Israel is just absolutely massacring civilians. It's also not achieving its objectives on the so-called battlefield. Scott, could you speak to this dichotomy here? Because I feel like there was some desperation at times in this speech with regard to public relations.
Well, first of all, you have to understand this entire trip to the United States is an act of desperation on the part of Benjamin Netanyahu. His political world is collapsing around his ears inside Israel. He's not very popular, to say the least. He is running. He's in one of these damned if you do, damned if you don't situations where the only way he remains viable as a prime minister is to be a wartime leader. But he's lost the war. Lost, not losing. Lost the war. He's lost the war in Gaza, and he can't fight the war against Hezbollah because the IDF is saying, we don't have any tanks. We're out of spare parts. We're out of ammunition. Our men are exhausted. We aren't designed to fight, an 8-9 month sustained conflict. That's not how our force structure works. If we go to war against Hezbollah, they'll kick the living dog poop out of us. They just flew a drone over, one of our most secret air bases, proving that A, we can't shoot them down. B, they know where the targets are, and C, if they have the weapons to hit them, they're going to hit them. Boss, we can't go against Hezbollah, which means if you can't expand the war against Hezbollah and you can't win the war in Gaza, you're not doing too well as a wartime leader. So he came to the United States to wrap the American flag around him. This is what he bought the U.S. Congress for, and it is bought and paid for by Israel. I know people say, oh, it's an American lobby. No, it's Israel. There's no difference between the pro-Israeli lobby and Israel. They're one and the same. And Israel has bragged, AIPAC has bragged about buying Congress. Every one of the primaries that they funded won because of their money. They put $24 million into one New York race to ensure that the seat went to a pro-Israeli person. And when you buy Congress, it exists to do a couple things. Keep funneling assistance, put pressure on an administration to ensure that Israel is backed up diplomatically, and then on occasion to provide song and dance shows like we saw here, where Netanyahu can be invited in. This is a disgraceful display by the ostensible representatives of the American people, a scripted affair designed to give him standing ovations. And everybody knew when to give the ovation, because the words didn't deserve the ovation. It was like the old Soviet Politburo, time to stand up and applaud, sit down. Oh, it's time to stand up and applaud, sit down. Oh, time to stand up and applaud. And Netanyahu took advantage of it. He's just throwing out dreck, throwing out pure, unadulterated garbage. And they're applauding not because they understand what he's saying or comprehend it, but because they're told to applaud. This was a pure theater where Netanyahu is putting out words that through their applause, they're certifying. Now he can go back to Israel because he's going to be put under a lot of pressure to accept a ceasefire that he doesn't want. But politically, I don't think he can survive much longer unless he does that, because he can't release the pressure valve of going to war against Hezbollah. They'll lose that war. So he's going to have to accept a ceasefire and to survive that turmoil, because he will lose the far right when he does this. His coalition will collapse. He needs to be able to turn to the center and say, I am the anointed leader. The United States anointed me. I just got back from Congress. You don't have what it takes to take on me now that America's backed me. So I'm your leader. Rally around me. We'll get through this. But if you go against me, you're going against America. And not too many of his political opponents have what it takes to go against the United States. So he's creating this perception that he is the anointed one of the United States. That's what this is all about. This is just about him being able to wrap the American flag around him, go back and build a political coalition that can govern when the right abandons him, because he has no choice but to accept a ceasefire. And I think when he meets with Biden, you're going to see Biden put the old arm lock on him and say, you have no choice here. Because here's the reality: even though Netanyahu has bought the U.S. Congress, at the end of the day, American interests will always outweigh Israeli interests. At the end of the day, if Israel ever puts us in a situation where supporting Israel is detrimental to the national security of the United States, Israel's in trouble, and they've put us in that position. We are watching the world leave us. We're watching the global South abandon us at the time when Russia, China, India are coming together in Kazan in October, which isn't very far away, and they're going to create this new entity called BRICS. It already exists, but what Russia is preparing to unleash on the world doesn't understand the preparation that Russia's made in conjunction. BRICS is going to go from being a theory to reality, and it's going to expand. It's going to become a global actor, and the United States is sitting there. We can't compete, and the people that we need to compete with are jumping ship, including some big ones. India. I mean, that bear hug that Putin put on Modi, should have the United States saying, "Oh my God, we lost our Indian partner," because you did lose your Indian partner at that point in time, and they're losing everybody. Everybody's jumping ship. Turkey, NATO member, jumping ship. Everybody, and so this is the reality, and the diplomats are weighing in, saying this blanket support for Israel is destroying us, ruining us. It's hurting the national security of the United States. And so Biden has no choice right now but to tell Netanyahu, you need to come on in line. You have to line up. You have to toe the line. You have to do what I tell you now. Because if you don't, it's over for you, and we're going to flush you down the toilet of life. We'll do it cleverly. We're not going to stop sending weapons and all that kind of stuff, but it'll be the end of Benjamin Netanyahu. We will ensure that he's done politically. We're in a political silly season. Up until a day ago, Biden was the Democratic nominee for this race, and so his legacy as president matters. I don't know what Kamala Harris is going to end up doing in terms of Palestine policy, et cetera. She seems to be playing somewhat of a political game right now, but we know Donald Trump is all in on Israel. So Biden has to take advantage of the time he has left to put pressure on Israel to get the United States in a position to where maybe we can stabilize this disaster that's unfolding diplomatically. And in order to do that, you have to give Netanyahu a way out. You can't insist that Netanyahu does something that is the political kiss of death. That's unreasonable. So Netanyahu's here. Congress is applauding him. He's the Middle East Winston Churchill. He's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Benjamin Netanyahu, God, you're the best. Go home and build your coalition because you son of a bitch, you're going to have a ceasefire or I'm flushing you down the toilet. That's the reality. Netanyahu's not a loved individual. He's a hated individual in the United States. Every one of those congressmen know what a scumbag this guy is. They know the truth about him, a corrupt individual, who was just a political survivor. But we're talking about politics right now, and I hope I don't get you banned for my language. I apologize, but that's what's happening here. We're wrapping the flag around him to give him the ability to survive the political turmoil that's going to result when he does what he has to do to keep American support, which is agree to some sort of ceasefire that is acceptable to Hamas.
Dan, jump in about this. A lot of media at the same time as Netanyahu was coming, I noticed, as Scott talks about a ceasefire, there was a lot of chatter in the Western mainstream media, Washington Post, New York Times, all talking about a ceasefire. In many respects, a lot of these articles would reference the threats of regional war. It's happening with Hezbollah. The only opportunity now, a lot of these so-called unnamed anonymous officials are saying, well, if Israel doesn't strike a ceasefire soon, doesn't agree to one, goes to war with Lebanon, there's going to be hell to pay. Could you talk about your book and how it can help us understand this particular moment in this historic conflict, genocide, brewing, and ever-increasing regional war?
Yes. So, as I discussed in the book, The Case for Palestine, what is happening now in Gaza, sadly, is, and I would not have used this term or any term like it before October 7th, because I'm someone who respects the memory of World War II and the Holocaust and the victims of the Holocaust. And so I don't use words related to that period lightly. But what's happening in Gaza is the final solution that Israel has for the Palestinians, and that is to get rid of every single one of them. The Israelis would have in 1948 if they could have. And Netanyahu saw October 7th as the justification to do what the Israelis have wanted to do for a long time, and that is get rid of the Palestinian people. That's why it's a genocide, right? They are trying to destroy the Palestinian people, in whole or in part. That's the language from the Genocide Convention. Sadly, in Gaza, it appears to be in whole. With the famine, the bombings, they've destroyed like 90% of the buildings there. Every single human being's been displaced in Gaza at least once. Over 2 million people. I mean, I have friends in Gaza. I'm writing to them. I have a friend, Ola, and she's not unique. I mean, she moved 4 times or 5 times in a week to run from the bombing. And you have disease now spreading throughout Gaza. And again, all of this is according to plan. At the beginning, I think it was Gallant, the defense minister at the time, who said that they were, going to lay siege to Gaza. They were going to cut off all the food, the water, the electricity. And that's what they've done. And all of this, as I said, is baked into the cake of Israel. The goal all along was to create, so the Israelis, as we know, have had this myth of a land without a people for a people without a land, right? So the myth was that Palestine was a land without a people. And the goal has been to make that myth a reality. And that is what's happening now. And so we've seen this process beginning in 48. It's been gradual up until October 7th of the Israelis slowly taking over more and more land, displacing more and more Palestinians, killing more and more Palestinians, making Gaza unlivable. In 2018, the UN predicted by 2020, Gaza would be unlivable because the Israelis made it as such. And it was made unlivable by 2020. Think about that for a second. I mean, it was unlivable before October 7th. But then after October 7th, that kind of slow-moving genocide became a rapid-moving genocide. And that's what we're witnessing right now. And it is important to see that historic process. Because history did not start on October 7th, as we are led to believe. It's been a very painful process for the Palestinian people, and it continues to this day.
Yes, indeed. And now I would like, and I'll get Scott back in here to comment on this part of what happened in relation to Netanyahu's speech. There's no shortage of examples of reasons why we as people in the United States, living in the United States, Americans, why we might feel disdain, shame about the behavior and actions and policies of our government, notwithstanding the scripted applause, as you were remarking on, Scott. But Netanyahu several times went after people in the United States protesting not only his speech, but of course his overall genocide. Here is one of those examples of what he had to say, tying it into, as always, his lust and thirst for a broader war with Iran.
Officially become Iran's useful idiots.
So essentially, he was calling all protesters outside. There's Rashida Tlaib, as you mentioned, Scott, talking lifting the only congressperson, the only one. And there were many who didn't show up, but she was the only one to stage any kind of action inside of the halls of Congress. None of them abided by the ICC warrant and requested and demanded arrest. And certainly all of those who didn't show up, were conducting their own kind of political theater. So Scott, talk about Netanyahu's just attack. He was attacking people in the ICC. He was attacking Americans for protesting his actions, calling them proxies of Iran.
He wasn't attacking people in America. He was attacking the United States of America, straight up, in the people's house. There's a reason why I'll never be elected a member of Congress. And one of the reasons is, had I been in that room, I would have stood up and walked to the stage and said, get him the hell out of here. You don't have a right, you foreign son of a bitch, to stand up in the people's house and criticize Americans for exercising their First Amendment rights of protest. You may not like what they're saying, but you better shut up in my country talking about my citizens doing this. I mean, and then to have these people who took an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, to have an enemy of America, because Netanyahu is an enemy of America, and he proved it because he's intolerant of the things that make America America, like the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. All these things, those protesters are out there. You may not agree with them. I have to tell you, there are many times when protesters are in the streets in the United States, and I don't agree with them one bit. I am bitterly opposed to the cause that they are protesting in support of, or I may support the cause that they're protesting against. I will die to give them the right to protest. I will be the first one on the street to protect them, to let them do what they do, because that's what being an American's all about. That's why we had a revolution. That's why we had the Constitution. And for Benjamin Netanyahu to stand on that stage and attack Americans made my blood boil. That's the kind when they say defend the Constitution against all enemies, you rush the stage, you tackle that son of a bitch, and you break his neck because you don't let him do that in the people's house. That's a frontal assault on American democracy. But the shameful part isn't just that he said it, but that we let him say it, and we applauded him saying that. Every single person who stood up and applauded, as Benjamin Netanyahu said, that should be targeted for removal from office. That is the real act of treason. That is the real betrayal of America. Again, you don't have to sit there and say, I support the protesters. You could actually agree with Benjamin Netanyahu that you don't support their cause. You could be a supporter of Israel and say these protesters are misguided. But to let him, a foreigner, stand in the people's house and condemn American citizens for doing what makes America great, that's unacceptable. It's disgusting. This is really one of the lowest moments in the history of the United States Congress, literally one of the lowest moments. We applauded a war criminal who was attacking American citizens for exercising their constitutional rights.
And Dan, what Scott is saying here just reminds me, this isn't Netanyahu's first go around in Congress. Many times he's come to Congress, he's tried to do something to undermine U.S. policy, whether it was the Iran nuclear deal under Obama. He's even, I believe in 2020, he took dirty laundry to the United States and had White House staffers wash it. But I wanted you to just comment on this particular moment that Netanyahu is doing this. He's not only attacking the United States, he's attacking the protesters. We had protesters. There was thousands upon thousands of them descending. Many of them wanted to do a citizen's arrest of someone who is, he has a warrant out for his arrest from the ICC. And so anyone who believes in the International Criminal Court, international law, would be for that. But of course, there was huge police presence. No one, of course, got near Netanyahu. Could you just talk about this moment? Because as Scott said, this is an embarrassment in many ways, like one of the most embarrassing moments in U.S. history. when it comes to him being able to come here at this time when this there might not be any time lower, not only for Israel's particular place in the world, but the United States as well.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, to state the obvious, we're in the midst of a presidential election campaign, right? All eyes are on this campaign. You had Donald Trump, who just survived an assassination attempt. The president of the United States, Joe Biden, has said he will not run again for election, which has rarely happened in U.S. history. The last person I remember doing that was Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1968. And amidst all this turmoil that we are suffering in this country, we invite this leader, so-called, who is committing genocide against another people, to speak, as Scott Ritter said, in the People's House in the United States Congress. It baffles me. It blows one's mind to think that at this time, certainly it would be bad at any time, but at this time in American history, the floor was ceded to someone like Benjamin Netanyahu to tell lies, to say that Israelis are protecting civilians when in fact they're targeting civilians and targeting civilian infrastructure, destroying mosques and churches and hospitals and universities, killing children, maiming children. There are more children who have lost limbs in this conflict than in any conflict ever in recorded history. I mean, even the folks who survive in Gaza will be left broken physically, mentally. Their society will be broken, and that, again, that is all according to plan. And you invite this person to address not just the U.S. Congress, but the nation. At this time, again, it's mind-boggling that this would happen. And it shows, honestly, the total corruption of our political system, of both parties. Both parties are complicit in this. Of course, this was, up until a couple days ago, Joe Biden's war, as much as it was Netanyahu's. And it is now, well, I guess it still is, but we'll see what happens to Joe Biden between now and November. But in any case, it has been Joe Biden's war, but of course supported by the Republicans. And I believe Netanyahu will be meeting with Trump in Florida at his house in Mar-a-Lago. So, the choice at the ballot box in November will be between, practically speaking, one supporter of genocide and another, though, of course, Jill Stein will be running, and who I'll probably vote for, by the way, but who probably does not stand a chance at winning. Even Bobby Kennedy, of course, is shown himself to be a dyed-in-the-wool Zionist. Unlike his uncle, by the way, John F. Kennedy, who actually tried to put some limits on Israel, who tried to make AIPAC follow the U.S. FARA law, the Foreign Agent Reporting Act, amongst other things, and to prevent Israel from getting nuclear weapons. Of course, we know what happened. He was killed. Kennedy. And there's very few presidents that have been willing to put any limits on Israel. Eisenhower did during the Suez Crisis. I'm, of course, in Egypt, where the Suez Canal is. And actually Reagan did during the assault of Israel upon Lebanon. But those are very, few and far between instances of the U.S. putting any brakes on Israel's attack of the Palestinians or other peoples. But again, the timing could not be worse, but actually it could not be more emblematic of the U.S.'s relationship with Israel. A relationship in which sometimes it's hard to know what is the dog and what is the tail. right? And who is wagging who? So at least to that extent, the American people see that dynamic happening and how much power Israel has over our political system, which should be very offensive and upsetting to all Americans.
Yeah. I mean, the hypocrisy of it all. You have people like Kamala Harris, Nancy Pelosi. They didn't show up for the speech, but throughout this entire period, I mean, we're entering month 9 of a genocide. We're coming toward a year. They've been championing Israel's right to defend itself this entire period. They have been receiving, and they have received hundreds of thousands, if not millions, from AIPAC. I mean, the hypocrisy is just so clear. And Scott, you can jump in here and just any closing thoughts about this moment with regard to Netanyahu's visits. I mean, his meetings with the presidents. We also had Biden at the same day he decided to give his I dropped out of the race 5-minute speech. It's a very odd day. This would be July 24th in American political and geopolitical history. So, Scott, any final thoughts on this question?
Look, oftentimes when we talk about, for instance, things like what Netanyahu is trying to accomplish, the political infighting in Israel, even the absolute tragedy of Gaza. I've said this before. I've stopped crying about the people of Gaza, not because I don't care. It's just how can you just overwhelmed with the death? I mean, it's just every day it's the same, the butchery, the slaughter, etc. And it wears you down to the point that you become numb, because that's part of a survival instinct. Otherwise you just collapse and you can't function if you actually. And it's a tragedy that's come to that, because every single death in Gaza deserves to be mourned, deserves tears, deserves people, ripping their hair out. But we're not there. But then I take a step back, and I am warmed, and that's the right word, by the recognition that Israel is fatally wounded, that it is over for Israel, that Netanyahu can humiliate America by coming and speaking before the Congress, but this will be a footnote in history, because soon all we'll be talking about when it comes to the Zionist entity known as Israel, this apartheid state, this genocide embracing, disaster of a nation, is how it disappeared, because it will disappear. I'm not promoting the violent destruction of Israel. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying that Israel, the greater Israel that exists today, this Zionist experiment, is incapable of continuing, because it is predicated on things that aren't going to happen. The Abrams Accord was designed to breathe life into greater Israel by killing the possibility of a Palestinian state. It literally killed the possibility of it. And it opened the door, because it got the collusion of Arab neighbors of Israel to agree that that the Palestinian state would die, that it wasn't going to happen, that instead they were going to get this greater prosperity, situation where people recognize Israel, open up diplomatic relations with Israel, begin economic interaction with Israel, and Israel becomes the economic hub of a regional economic transformation. That was the goal. That was the objective. That's not going to happen. There will be no. Remember, a couple of years ago, Joe Biden stood in India and said, "We're going to have the India-Middle East Economic Corridor, and this is going to be the." Benjamin Netanyahu spoke at the General Assembly. Instead of putting up a cartoon of an Iranian bomb, as he normally does, he put up a map bragging about how this was going to save Israel. This was the future of Israel. No, it's not. Never going to happen. Israel is fatally wounded. The Israeli experiment, the Zionist experiment, has been shown to be a fraud. Israel will never again live in peace. Never again live in peace. The axis of resistance will always be there with the potential to rain death and destruction down on Israel. Israel is going to be compelled to accept the reality of a two-state solution, knowing that a two-state solution is the end of Israel, because to achieve a two-state solution, Israel will be called upon to terminate the West Bank thievery that's taking place, the murder and theft. They will have to dismantle. He said, and that's the end of Israel right there, because now all the Brooklyn Jews that went over there to steal Palestinian homes will be thrown out physically and leave. There'll be a near civil war in Israel over this, worse than what happened in Gaza in I think 2005 when they dismantled the Gazan settlements. This will be 10 times worse. And what you'll see is that the people will start fleeing Israel. We've already seen, 500,000 Israelis leave. You're going to see millions of Israelis leave. And in a nation that counts 9-10 million people, you lose 3 to 4 million people, you're done, you're finished. And that's the future of Israel. And that's what warms my heart, knowing that the axis of resistance, knowing that Hamas, knowing that the sacrifice of the Palestinian people has led to the condition that Israel has inflicted. It's a self-inflicted fatality. Israel did it to itself. Israel is the one that lost the faith of the world by committing genocide. Israel is the one that prompted criminal indictments from the International Criminal Court. Israel's the one that got the International Court of Justice to recognize its apartheid state status. All of this is done by Israel. So I'm thankful to Israel for doing this. I'm glad Hamas initiated what it did on October 7th, because it allowed Israel to be Israel, Israel to show the world the reality of this sick, murderous, genocidal regime, and for Israel to shoot itself fatally. I don't know how long it's going to take for the death of Israel to occur, but I know this: Israel is finished. It's over for Israel. And when the two-state solution is put out there and the Israeli aspect of it collapses, as it will collapse, then it's a one-state solution, Palestine, hopefully a Palestine where Muslims live together in peace and harmony with Christians and Jews. Remember, there's a difference between Zionists and Jews. Jews should not be prosecuted. Jews should have every right to live in Palestine as members of that broader monolithic community, but people who worship the same God, but not Zionist. The Zionist entity is dead, and that's what warms my heart, and that's what makes all the death and suffering that's taken place have meaning. It's given purpose to the martyrdom of so many. And that's what I live for. I literally hope that before I die, I have the absolute privilege of watching the Zionist entity be wiped off the map of modern civilization and replaced by a singular state known as Palestine.
Well, I wanted to now slightly transition before we get to Ukraine and just talk about one more aspect and element of this, and that is how the broader multipolar world is reacting and engaging with this genocide, this conflict. And I wanted to, Dan, we can start with you. There was just a historic, right before Netanyahu gave his speech, a historic agreement brokered by China amongst 14 Palestinian resistance groups, political organizations, basically agreeing to establish a unified government of Palestine, unified state of Palestine under the Palestine Liberation Organization. And the document adhered to Palestine's right to armed resistance, and even the Western mainstream media had to, even though they said that there's a lot of pessimism around it, they had to acknowledge it as incredibly significant. You've also had, Russia has had a lot of, activity around this conflict too, also hosting Palestinian organizations for the same purpose a couple of times over the last year. So maybe you could comment on the role and the contrast between how the rising powers in the multipolar world have reacted to this conflict and engaged with this conflict versus the United States and, of course, whoever its allies are.
Yeah, it is pretty incredible to see Russia and China stepping up as you say, to support the Palestinians to broker unity between the resistance groups in Palestine. It has, frankly, a feel from the old days when the Soviet Union still existed. In Russia's foreign policy these days looks a lot like the Soviet Union's foreign policy. And in fact, I believe it was May of 2022, the Foreign Ministry of Russia put out a white paper on their foreign policy. And in paragraph 5, they said that Russia is a legal successor to the Soviet Union. And as such, it would continue the two main policies of the Soviet Union, which were anti-fascism and anti-colonialism, supporting the anti-colonial struggle. And that's exactly what Russia and China are doing with Palestine in particular right now, which is very heartening. As Scott said, I think you will see the quickening of the end of Zionism, which has to go. It is a hateful philosophy and has become more hateful over time. Of course, my concern, and I think a lot of people's concern, is how many people will die in the process of Zionism dying. How many people will Israel take with it? And will Gaza survive it? Right? Will Zionism end before Gaza is destroyed? And I pray that it is, but I fear for the future of Gaza. Of course, one has to. But the world, I think the people of the world, it's not hyperbolic to say the people of the world are with Palestine. Even in the West, the people largely are. They certainly don't want to see this slaughter happening in Gaza. The truth is the governments of the West don't really well represent their own people in terms of that. Not in terms of Gaza, or frankly, by this time, not even in Ukraine. Most Americans want to stop funding Ukraine. The Europeans, we're seeing elections that are showing that the Europeans are turning against that war as well in Ukraine, and certainly against the war in Gaza. So, as you say, the multipolar world is fully in birth at this moment, spurred on at first, and again, I guess as we transition, by the special military operations of Russia and Ukraine. I mean, that almost overnight, it was incredible to see how the multipolar world really blossomed after that. And then after October 7th, we're seeing it grow and strengthen even more. So, again, I am heartened by that. The unipolar world that the U.S. created after the collapse of the Soviet Union was an ugly world. The U.S. could have, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, been a harbinger of peace in this world. It decided to go the opposite way. It decided to use its power in the world to wage war, particularly in the Muslim world. I mean, that has to be pointed out. It's been estimated that 4 million Muslims lost their lives since the so-called war on terror began on 9/11, after 9/11. 4 million people, that's an incredible number. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. In the Congo, 6 million people, at least, have been killed. And by the way, that slaughter continues. We have to have, all eyes on Gaza. But meanwhile, in Congo and Sudan, you have incredible bloodshed that's happening that's getting almost no attention at all. And maybe we have to save that for another day. But these are, again, all wars of empire that the West has been waging. And, to build upon what Scott said, not only is Zionism seeing the end of days, the U.S. empire is seeing the end of days as well. But again, many people will suffer and die as that empire collapses.
Yeah, and Scott, maybe you can comment on not just the Beijing Declaration. Also, you mentioned Russia and Yemen, the Houthis, the Ansar Allah. perhaps striking a deal around arms. We've had the axis of resistance in large part embrace both Russia and China. Of course, there are going to be disagreements, and I'm sure that there are disagreements among them. But overall, the overall policy has been moving toward, whether it's Iran's relationship, Yemen's relationship, or the rest of the axis of resistance relationship with Russia and China. So could you comment on this in the context of this pretty monumental, not getting a lot of coverage or maybe as much coverage given Netanyahu's visit, but given this huge declaration that happened at the same time?
Well, I mean, again, this is what I was alluding to before, where, right now our mainstream media in the West, the United States, is focused on Netanyahu's speech. It will be a footnote in history. When the eventual book is written about this time, his speech will literally just be a footnote because it's meaningless. It's I got to watch my language. I'm very angry right now, so I have to be very careful because I can immediately go into Marine Corps mode and use language that probably isn't appropriate. So
these are infuriating times, but continue.
His words are meaningless words. It's just hot air coming out of his mouth. It's infuriating, but what historians will reflect on is this. Israel said that they will not do business with Hamas. That's one of their red lines. And I understand that's even though I don't support the Israeli government, if I'm being honest as a mediator, that's a tough one to swallow. To tell Israel, no, you got to sit down at the table with Hamas. What China did is there's no more Hamas. I mean, it exists, but China has created this fusion entity that now has legitimacy, that will be able to sit down and negotiate. And Israel has no choice now. No choice. Israel can't say that's Hamas. It's not Hamas. It's something different. Hamas is part of it. This was a brilliant act of diplomacy by China. I should point out that I think Russia actually initiated this effort. They brought Hamas and the PLA into Moscow to have the discussions. This is part of that collusion taking place between Russia and China about what a multipolar world should look like, which is a world that seeks peaceful resolutions to some of the most difficult problems. Remember, it was Russia again initiating dialogue, China closing the deal on the normalization of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is a fundamental game changer. Both those nations now are going to be sitting at the BRICS table, unimaginable 5 years ago, to talk about that. That happened. Now Russia and China have created the conditions where Israel will have to sit down with this fusion element and do business with. They can't say that's Hamas. This is the genius of what has happened here, and people need to be talking about that. But there's another aspect of it too, because Russia, I always advise people. You both know who Ray McGovern is, right? Dan, you've met Ray McGovern?
Yes.
Yes, he's been on the show.
I know he's been on the show. Ray McGovern, first of all, he's just a hell of a nice guy. I mean, you can't help but love Ray McGovern. He's literally, every man's grandpa, the grandpa you just dreamed of having, because he's that good of a guy. But he's a man who used to be a CIA analyst. Back in the day, when I worked with the CIA, I was never in the CIA, but when I worked with them, we called the Soviet branch SOVA, Soviet Affairs, and that was the sort of the brain of all Soviet-related analysis. He predates the Soviet Affairs, so he's before SOVA. I made the mistake once of saying, "Oh, Ray was with SOVA," and he called me up and said, "Scott, I'm before SOVA." That's how old he is. But Ray taught me a couple things. He said, stop distrusting Russian media and the statements made by Russian politicians, because it's a carryover from Soviet times where, we had Sovietologists who would literally look at photographs and look at how close people are standing to whom to determine what the power structure is in the Politburo. Oh my God, Kosygин's wearing a fur hat and he's 4.6 inches from Brezhnev. The world is coming to an end, kind of thing. And he said, no, all you have to do is read the Soviet press. read the statements made, listen to the speeches. They're not lying. They get up there and they say something because that's what they're going to do. Putin is one of the most transparent leaders out there. He meets all the time with the governors, with his own cabinet, and the minutes of these meetings are published. You can watch it on YouTube. You can read it if you have the patience to do this. You know, I'm a specialist in this, so this is what I do for a living. That's why I'm pretty boring. But the fact of the matter is, Putin has said some things like, you fired, the America and Europe gave Ukraine weapons that they then used to attack Russia. And there will be a price to pay. We are holding you accountable, and we will pay the price. Now, immediately people jumped on that and said, oh my God, Russia's going to hit American forces. Russia's not that crude or crass. And they came out and they said, no, it'll be an asymmetric response, which means they're going to come at it a different. And then later on, he said what that means. We're going to provide weapons to the enemies of the United States and Europe so that those weapons can be used to attack the United States and Europe. That's what's going to happen. And we will pick the time and place. I believe, because right after Israel struck Yemen in retaliation for the Houthi drone strike on Tel Aviv, I think Lavrov, who's chairing the Security Council right now, said that Russia will not sit on the sidelines forever, that Russia is going to get involved. I think Russia has gotten involved. Russia just finalized a very detailed defense agreement with Iran. And I believe there's classified annexes to that. And I think one of the classified annexes deal with the transfer of Russian military equipment to Iran with the intention of Iran transferring it to Yemen, to the Houthi. Why? Well, Russia shouldn't be landing IL-76s in Sana'a airport. That's not asymmetric. That's in your face. Iran already has a very efficient logistics system set up where they are transferring weapons to Yemen. So Iran will continue that, but now the weapons are going to be more modern. They're going to be weapons that can sink U.S. naval vessels in the Red Sea. If they get the Onyx anti-ship missile system, that's a certainty. And they're going to get missiles that can strike Israel without being shot down. And this is the escalation. This is what Russia promised to do. So this is the other side of the coin. On the one hand, you have genius diplomacy taking place that sets the condition for peace. But on the other hand, you have realpolitik where the Russians are going to follow through, because Ray McGovern told me when Russia says something, take it to the bank, are going to follow through with the asymmetric warfare. They're going to provide these weapons to Yemen through a proxy, Iran, and those weapons will be used to great effect against Israel and the United States. The gloves are off. You don't get to fire ATACMS missiles at Crimea and kill vacationers on a Sevastopol beach without there being repercussions. And the repercussions will be a heavily armed Yemen. And what is Israel going to do? Bomb Yemen? Get in line, man. The Saudis have been doing it since 2014. America and the British tried to do it, couldn't accomplish the objective. The Yemeni have just gotten stronger, gotten better. I mean, and that's what people are going to be writing about, not Benjamin Netanyahu's pathetic little charade of a speech in front of the U.S. Congress, the disgrace of the U.S. Congress. They're going to be talking about the diplomacy of Russia and China and the asymmetric warfare that's going to break the back of Israel and the United States in the region. And, I'm not happy about this. I just have to be honest. I'm an American, and I don't want American sailors to die. I don't want American soldiers to die or airmen to die. I want them to get the hell out of that region and come home and live. But we don't have politicians that think sanely. We don't have military officials that understand the limits of power, and we're going to end up sailing ships into harm's way. And we're going to lose these ships, and we're going to lose Americans, and it's going to break my heart. But it is the inevitable the inevitable consequence of empirical overreach. America is trying to do too much with too little, with no international support, and most importantly, no legitimacy. We lack legitimacy of purpose in everything we do in the Middle East today.
Yeah, Dan, I want to give you actually the final comment on this before we move on, because I'd like to hear your assessment, not just of what Scott said, but also given these developments, adding in the fact that Russia has promised, and this was a while ago, this was when the United States and NATO, everyone was coming in and saying, we're going to allow Ukraine to use our weapons to strike deep into Russian territory. Russia said, okay, well, we're going to start arming your adversaries, because that is what you would call an eye for an eye. That's the proper response. So can you talk about in the context of this, especially with Yemen? Yemen just landed a pretty big hit on Tel Aviv, a very embarrassing one. And now they could very well find themselves even more heavily armed and even more impressively armed than they already have been, which, not only do they have friends in the Axis of Resistance, but they also have, they're not a stranger to government. They do have a military. They do have access to their own government, as beleaguered as it's been by a U.S.-Saudi invasion. So your final words, Dan.
Yeah, no, first of all, cheers to Yemen. I mean, it's one of the poorest countries on earth. As Scott said, it's been a victim of a very brutal war since 2014, again, supported by the United States and Great Britain. Some believe that was a genocidal war as well, which also led to a famine in Yemen. And still, this very poor country, war-torn country, has crippled the shipping of the world in the Red Sea to support Gaza. They don't have to do that. They are sacrificing themselves to do that. And one can only applaud it, in my view. The Genocide Convention of 1948 says that, the nations of the world have an obligation to stop and prevent genocide when they see it. And Yemen is actually taking that seriously. It's one of the few countries that's actually physically doing something about it. But in terms of, Russia and its statements about, retaliating against the West through proxies, the West, and the U.S. in particular, has had the luxury for basically its whole history of going to war with other countries without being attacked in return, right? Even when we lose tens of thousands of troops like we did in Vietnam, you never saw Vietnamese on the streets of New York City fighting us, right? But they could have. They would have had every right to do that, right? And, it was inevitable at some point. You will reap what you sow. You cannot go to war with the rest of the world. You cannot support a war against Russia. As you said, support Ukraine to target civilians deep within Russia, to target Russia's radar defense systems that were designed not to defend against, countries like Ukraine that are next door, but to defend against intercontinental ballistic missiles from the United States. You can't do that and expect forever not to be hit in return. And Americans are used to that, though. Americans, are shocked to think that other countries would somehow strike back. But it will happen. And, again, people cannot expect to go to war and have it a totally unilateral thing, which, again, the Americans have had for so long. And Americans need to start waking up that we have carried out these wars abroad, destroyed entire nations, destroyed civilizations, destroyed antiquities of the world, again, particularly in the Middle East. They have to wake up to that destruction, and that we at some point will feel the real repercussions of that. They're coming, and they're also coming economically.
Well, let's talk about Ukraine as our last topic, and then there's just a few, I think, super chat questions, not even questions, but just comments. We'll pull them up. Scott, I wanted to start with you with regard to Ukraine. Dmytro Kuleba, foreign minister of Ukraine, meeting with Wang Yi in China. A lot of talk about peace. We have Zelensky talking about peace now. A lot more talk about peace. But even Wang Yi said the time isn't ripe. Tell us what's going on in the conflict right now, because I notice that there isn't a lot of attention as there once was, especially in the Western mainstream media, about how things are going beyond maybe comments on frozen conflict, F-16s not making it to the battlefield. Could you give an overview, if you could, of what exactly is going on, what direction it's heading in?
Well, one thing we could say right off the bat is there is no frozen conflict right now. Russia is advancing steadily on all fronts. The pressure that Russia's putting on Ukraine is breaking the back of Ukraine. Ukraine has literally run out of troops. One of the reasons why Russia was able to advance 6.5 kilometers yesterday in a critical sector is because Ukraine didn't have any troops to counterattack with. They fell back to an intermediate line, didn't have enough troops. They had to fall back further. Ukraine's used to shuttling troops around the front. They have a handful of brigades, 6 to 8 of them, that are used as sort of fire brigades, pulled out of one sector, sent to another sector, and they shuttle them back. When they get burned out, they pull back, they regroup, send them back in. One of these brigades is the 47th Brigade. The 47th Brigade was pulled out of the line, sent up towards Chasiv Yar to stabilize the situation, that critical city. As they were offloading from a train, they got hit by 2 Iskander missiles, took out a battalion worth of men, and took out a bunch of equipment. The 47th Brigade is no longer combat effective. That's their fire brigade. The fire brigade didn't arrive at the fire. Chasiv Yar is burning. The Russians are advancing. When Chasiv Yar falls, and it will, this is going to, unhinge the Ukrainian defensive line, and they'll be compelled to fall back even further, putting cities like Kramatorsk at risk. This is what we're seeing. We're seeing this bad news all over. The 31st Brigade, another one of their fire brigades, was supposed to launch a counterattack. The Russians instead preempted it with a pincer movement. The 31st couldn't get withdrawn in time, and now several battalions of the 31st are surrounded, and they're going to die. That's the end of the 31st Brigade. That's 2 of the well-known fire brigades there, very, very veteran units with a good track record of resisting the Russians. They're gone. And more units are disappearing like this on a daily basis. Ukraine's losing a brigade's worth of troops every day, and they're not getting more than a battalion's worth of troops as replacements. You can't sustain this military math. We are looking at the collapse is happening as we speak. Ukraine is desperate for manpower. They're desperate for equipment. So why all of a sudden are they screaming peace? First of all, let's understand that Ukraine's not asking for peace. Let's just be serious. They're asking for Russian surrender. That's their terms. They're ridiculous terms. Russia is not going back to the 2022 borders. Russia's not going back to the 1991 borders. Russia's not going to accept a frozen battlefield. Russia's winning right now. What Ukraine is doing is creating the conditions so that I think a decision's been made in Ukraine that they better start preparing for a Donald Trump presidency. Now that I think any American knows that in July, if you try and predict what's going to happen in November, you're a fool. There's a lot of time between now and November where, anything can happen. Hell, we just came from a month where one candidate almost got assassinated, and we have a soft coup that eliminated another candidate. Ain't American democracy great? So who knows what's going to happen between now and November? Nobody. But the Ukrainians are saying we need to hedge our bets right now. We need to demonstrate why. Because Donald Trump has spoken with Zelensky. Zelensky knows Donald Trump's plan. He knows that Trump who thinks he can solve this problem with a series of phone calls. Now, the first phone call would be to Zelensky that says, you have to accept the following conditions. Zelensky now is in a position of saying, I've already done it. I'm saying we're ready for this. We're ready for peace right now. But the conditions Trump wants to impose is to give Russia Crimea, but Russia has to give back Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk. It's just not going to happen. Russia, I think, is in the process of saying, no, you don't seem to understand, Donald. We're taking Odessa, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, and Mykolaiv as well. We might take Sumy just because we're really pissed off right now. And that's the direction Russia's heading. I mean, when you have Lavrov say he can't envision a peace that allows Russian populations to be governed by the Ukrainians anymore, that's the closest I've heard a senior Russian official saying that Odessa is going to be Russian. I think that's the reality. Ukraine should have taken Putin's peace plan when he put it on the table back, on the eve of their pathetic little peace summit in Switzerland. They didn't take it. And as Putin said, remember, Ray McGovern's rule number one: listen to the Russians. They're going to tell you what they're going to do. And Putin said, if you don't take it, it's off the table, and you're never getting it back. And what you're going to get is much worse. It'll be we will dictate unconditional terms of surrender. That's it. That's the only way this war ends. Trump, though, has said if Ukraine agrees to the peace formula, then he will make a phone call to Putin. Okay. And he will tell Putin that if Putin has to, give back the new territories, they can have Crimea. And Putin will tell Trump to pound sand. And then Trump's response is, we will flood Ukraine with weapons, which is what Ukraine wants. So all this talk about peace and everything, Ukraine is trying to set the conditions that will compel Donald Trump to flood Ukraine with weapons. The bad news for Ukraine is that America doesn't have weapons to flood Ukraine with. And the other bad news is I think Donald might want to run that past his Republican friends and allies in the Congress. That's sort of not the way America's headed. Our military certainly can't sustain that, but that's been Donald Trump's problem all along, is that he just opens his mouth and verbal diarrhea ushers forth, and it's not backed by anything that remotely resembles reality, which brings me to the conclusion of this. This war is going to be won by Russia. This war will end when Russia decides it's over, and it will end on terms that Russia will dictate not only to Ukraine, but to the West. The only voice that counts anymore is Vladimir Putin's voice. And to think that, Kuleba can go to China and get the Chinese to, does he really think that he can strip China away from the Russian, orbit and turn China against Russia? Because that's sort of what Kuleba's acting like is happening. He doesn't understand that China and Russia have already worked all this out, that they know exactly what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, on what timetable. There's no light between Russia and China on Ukraine anymore. No, there used to be early on, not anymore. This war is over. We don't know when it's going to be over, but it's over. The Ukraine cannot flip the script on this one. And the final determination of what post-conflict Ukraine will look like is Vladimir Putin's and Vladimir Putin's alone. Ukraine will not have a vote. Kuleba won't be the foreign minister. Zelensky won't be the president. None of these people that are in power today will be at that table. There will be. It's like, at the end of World War II, who sat down and negotiated the surrender of Berlin? Was it Adolf Hitler? Nah, he had to put a bullet in his head. Was it Joseph Goebbels? Nah, he had to do the same thing. Was it any of those bigwig Nazis? Nah, they were all dead or fled. It was General Krebs, or a German general that had to sit down and say, it's over. I am betting a dime to a dollar that when this is all done, it's going to be Ukrainian general sitting down with the Russians, signing the surrender document that Russia is going to put in front of them.
Yeah, no, that goes very well in line with Russia's stance right now, that whoever is running the Ukrainian government, from Zelensky to whoever else is sitting in there, is not valid. I mean, Zelensky's time has been up since May. and Russia has not acknowledged that his leadership is legitimate. Dan, could you come in and talk about too? Both you and Scott have been to the Donbass. Both of you have been on the front lines of what's been going on to a certain extent. Could you elaborate also on maybe the why of what Scott is talking about? Because he said, this is going to end on Russian terms. You've seen it for yourself, what's been going on there. Why is it then that Russia would take such a hard stance, even as it is kind of in the driver's seat when it comes to the conflict?
Yes. So since the special military operations began, I've been to Russia 5 times. I've been to Crimea. I've been to the Donbass 3 times. I just got back from Lugansk about a month ago, and I was in Kherson as well. So what I can say is Russia will take those territories not just because they're winning the war, but because, frankly, the people in those regions want to be part of Russia. That's the dirty little secret that the West doesn't want to talk about. That, first of all, these regions are historically part of Russia, particularly Crimea, particularly the Donbass, which is made up of Luhansk and Donetsk. These were the heart of Russia. They were the heart of the Soviet Union. And particularly the Donbass was a victim of the government of Kiev since 2014. 14,000 people died in the conflict between Kiev and the Donbass before the special military operations even began in 2022. And unless you know that history, you really shouldn't have any opinion on what's happening in Ukraine. Because the people in the Donbass know that. People in Crimea know that. They don't want to go back to Ukraine. Not because they hate the Ukrainians, but because the right-wing government that the U.S. helped install in 2014 decided it was going to go after its Russian-speaking population, its ethnic Russians. It was going to treat them as second-class citizens. That resulted, again, in a war that killed 14,000 people, and those people ain't going back to Ukraine. And that's the reality I want Americans to know. And many Americans don't know what a Donbass is, right? But they should learn about it. And they should learn about Crimea and the history there. And they would have a very different opinion, I think, of what's happening. And that's why those regions won't go back to Ukraine.
And Scott, maybe a final word on the conflict, or Dan afterward. What have you made of recent polls coming out of Ukraine talking about how there is more of an appetite of coming to terms with Russia? Do you find that to be aligned with the overall condition that the Ukrainian military, as well as the entire society, as well as the status of the U.S. and NATO's capacity to fight this conflict? How have you viewed this, given that for the longest time we were hearing that Ukrainians were all in on this, and you've talked about this as well, is that there has been a lot of fervor and passion for joining on the front, joining the front lines and essentially dying for this cause?
Well, I mean, first of all, we can't dispute the fact that there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Ukrainian soldiers who believe in Ukraine and are willing to fight and die for Ukraine. Every Russian officer and soldier I spoke to who was in the special military operation had nothing but praise for their Ukrainian counterparts, the bravery of these men, the tenacity of these men, and the respect they have for people who are willing to fight to the death for what they believe in. I mean, it's war's war, but the Russians, you don't hear the Russian soldiers saying these guys are a bunch of cowards, they're useless. They're like, no, if we don't watch what we do, they kill us because they're pretty good. So there's people out there that are fighting. We should never forget that point, that the Ukrainians are putting up a hell of a fight against a very good Russian army. But they're running out of troops. But here's the thing, and maybe Dan can talk about this too, because he's been to Russia a lot more times than I have, and I think he probably has a broader base of experience to draw upon. But my more narrow base has me comparing and contrasting, even as recent as May of last year, 2023, what I would call sympathy in Russia for the Ukrainians, empathy even, compassion. There was not, the Russian people weren't hard against the Ukrainians. They were still coming to grips with this war, but it was mainly their ire was directed towards NATO, towards the West, and they weren't holding Ukraine accountable for that. I don't think that situation exists today. This is my take. And again, Dan can correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm willing to be wrong because I don't claim to know everything about Russia. But my sense is that there's been a hardening of Russia towards the Ukrainians, and that the direction that the Russian people are is finish this war regardless of the cost to Ukraine. And they're not asking for war crimes. They're not asking for this, but the day of worrying about, the suffering of the Ukrainian people is long past. The Russians have buried too many Russians. And they want this war to end, and they don't care, the reason why I brought that up is the polls don't matter anymore. Russia doesn't care anymore. There was a time when polls like that might have resonated inside Russia, generated some discussion. But from my perspective, the Russian people have just become hard. Look, I've seen it even here in the United States. I've watched the attitude of the Russian ambassador and the Russian embassy shift dramatically from a time when their number one priority was how to get the American people inoculated against the disease of Russophobia. They wanted to win the hearts and minds of the American people. And today they don't care. They don't give a damn about us. I mean, they're just like, the hell with you. It's just this callous indifference that comes when recognizing that the United States collectively is unwilling to engage in constructive dialogue, unwilling to engage in anything that brings about, a mutually acceptable conclusion. Therefore, Russia will go its own way. And that's what's happened. I think the Russian people have just said, nah, we don't care. Ukraine's, the hell with you, finish this war. And the Russian diplomats are saying, look, America doesn't want to be constructive, doesn't want to engage, then the hell with America. I don't think the Russians are losing too much sleep about Russophobia in America today. I think they're like, yep, that's a disease. It's like hydrophobia. Let it kill America. We don't care anymore. We've moved on. We got BRICS. We got Eurasia. We've got all this other stuff happening that's expanding our interaction in the world today. And I'll just leave you with one last observation that was just a very fascinating observation I got from a Russian professor recently. Normally, when I interview Russians, it's the purpose of it is going back to my idea of trying to inoculate Americans against Russophobia is to get the Russian perspective about Russia so they can empower me, empower people who are listening, so we have an understanding about Russia. But I decided that given what was happening in America, I wanted to get the Russian perspective about my country, what was going on. And the most fascinating observation was made, and it's one that I think everybody should reflect on. He said that he was a man who was alive when the Soviet Union fell. He was a man that experienced, the Soviet Union during the latter stages of perestroika, the collapse of Soviet society. And he said, when we look at America today, we see the Soviet Union at the end of perestroika. We're seeing the collapse of American society. And I was taken aback. I'm like, no. What the hell are you talking about? And then I reflect on it. This election is crazy. An assassination attempt that may have been orchestrated by elements of the U.S. government. A soft coup that was definitely orchestrated by elements of the U.S. government. The weaponization of a judiciary, society firmly divided, $36 trillion in debt, unsustainable economic. The guy's right. Again, Ray McGovern always said, listen to the Russians. they'll tell you something, and you should keep it in mind. The Russians are looking at America today, and there's a reason why they don't necessarily want to work with us anymore, because they see a society that's in a death spiral, and it's a tragedy for them. They used to love the America and respect the America of 20 years ago, but today they look at America, and it's like watching an old sick animal, perish in the field. You can't save it; it's going to die, and it's a tragedy because at one time you loved that animal. Russia's looking at America, and they're watching us die. And for an American who loves my country, that was a very, very difficult observation to hear, and a more difficult reality to start acknowledging as I reflected on what the guy said.
Yes, Dan. Thanks, Scott. Final comment on, I know Scott wanted to bring you in. So final word before, and then we'll go over some super chats and close. You're muted. There you go.
Yeah. So I will after I end my remarks, I will go. It's 5:30 in the morning here, so I'm about to begin my day. But I will just end. First of all, I agree, Scott, with everything you said. And what I'll say is that one of the great tragedies here is that Russia wanted to be part of the West, wanted to be part of Europe, dating back to Peter the Great, right? And the Russians fully thought after the Soviet Union collapsed that they would be admitted back into the West and into Europe. And it wasn't Russia that decided that wasn't going to happen. It was the West that said, no, we don't want you. And it took a long time for the Russians to wake up to the fact that they weren't wanted by the West. And they know that now. And as you say, they could live without us now. They will, in the end, forgive us. They're very forgiving people. We will be friends again, as we've been historically. The Russians supported the Revolutionary War, supported Lincoln in the Civil War, of course, played a huge role in defeating the Nazis in World War II. Russia should be our friend. But they could live without us now because they know how much the West hates them, and it's a terrible thing. But at the end of the day, we will deal with Russia again, and they will deal with us. But it will be on different terms. They will not come back as beggars. That's for sure. And they will demand respect, which they deserve, of course. And we will have to learn to respect them. Those are my final words. And I want to thank you for having me. Scott, always great to be with you. Danny, thank you.
Yeah.
And buy my book, The Case for Palestine.
Yeah, everyone, Matt, this is a great time because we're just going to be doing a few super chats and then heading out ourselves. So as Dan leaves here, be sure, go to the video description and get that book, The Case for Palestine. The link is there. Skyhorse Publishing. Many ways to buy it. Dan,
can I just throw something? Dan, rumor has it you're going to be in New York City on the 4th of August.
Yes, I'm coming for that brunch to see you, Scott.
Absolutely. Oh, awesome.
Could you do me a favor?
Yeah.
Bring some copies of your books, and we got a crowd there, and promote your book, and let's sell some copies of your book too.
You got it, Scott. Thank you. I appreciate that very much.
Very cool.
Okay, and Danny, you're invited to that too. So
right. Yeah. No, I need to. Right.
Thank you very much, guys.
Yes.
Have a good evening.
Take care. Bye, Dan.
Bye-bye.
All right, Scott. So let's do we'll do a rapid fire here. We
authors
can do your
care of authors. That's what we got to do,
Yeah, no, totally. It's such a, because with my, with my book too, like from years ago, this 2019, it's just hard to promote books and publishers. I know you have Clarity Press. I know that they're very good and friendly. Most publishers, though, if they're good publishers, they don't have a lot to help. They might not have the capital, and the publishers that don't really like our work, that have the capital, they don't.
Why
they don't promote it.
Why aren't you publishing with Clarity Press? You're
I
among
don't know. I haven't.
me because I'm a right wing conservative. You know?
I published with Skyhorse because of Dan. Actually,
Oh, okay.
he connected me. That was my singular book. I have a relationship with Clarity because they're always, sending me books and whatnot. So definitely, I mean, if I write another book, let's say on China or something of that sort, Clarity Press will definitely be, number one or one. I don't know if there's any other publishers out there wanting to publish my work, but Clarity Press will definitely be number one just because, they would be the most open by far. I actually have in Cynthia McKinney's book on how the U.S. creates shithole countries. I have an essay in there, and that's a Clarity Press book. So I guess I am technically in.
You are technically
yeah.
the author.
It was a republished article, but yeah. So all right, well, let's do this, Scott, and then we can head out of here. So just thanks to Jack for becoming a member. Rufus has some kind words for you, Scott, for doing so many interviews, always educating on geopolitical matters, especially Russia. Now here's a question. So thanks, Rufus, from Studio, who's always giving very generous super chats. So thank you. Is there any way for the U.S. secular cycle can be fixed? I guess we can call it elections. And do you think Russia will benefit long-term from having this war, which could avoid global population decline? It's a massive timeline. Nobody talks about forced solutions. Not sure what Studio is referencing in that latter part. But we do, I don't know if they meant election cycle or I don't know what they mean by that. But Scott, I'll let you interpret that.
Yeah, it's tough to do it. What I can say is this. Russia has taken a very difficult situation and made the best out of it. And as things stand, Russia has definitely benefited from this. Not only militarily. I mean, General Christopher Kovalik recently gave a presentation where he said, look, when this war ends, regardless of how it ends, NATO is going to have to deal with the reality of Russia having a very large, very well-equipped, very experienced army, and Russia being sort of angry at Europe. That's one aspect. But this war has also supercharged BRICS, supercharged the transition from American hegemony, the rules-based international order, to this new multipolarity, and taking it, as I said earlier, it's no longer theory, it's reality. And Russia will benefit from this. The good news is that Russia is not the United States, that Russia understands the danger of a military industrial complex that's taken over the economy and become politicized, because that's what happened in the Soviet Union with the massive defense spending helped bring about the economic collapse. And Russia guards against this. So, this war will end. And when this war ends, you will see Russia make a transition away from, the unnecessary defense industry and go back to, doing the kind of civilian focused production that the Russian economy and the global economy needs. So Russia's not addicted at this point to the military-industrial complex, the Russian military-industrial complex, and that's a good thing. So I think Russia, this politically, Vladimir Putin is just won an election back in March, overwhelming election that gives him a mandate. He doesn't win that election. Now, he wins the election, but doesn't win that election with those margins if it weren't for this war. So this war has been a very empowering thing. It's allowed Vladimir Putin to put a new benchmark out there for what defines Russian patriotism. Because before the war, you had a lot of Russians were relearning what patriotism meant. And many Russians continued to be ashamed of Russia, the Russia of the 1990s, and continued to look to the West as saying that's the model of what we should be and how we should be. That's not happening anymore. Russians have looking inward to Russia, loving Russia, and moving forward on that. And again, all of this happened because of the war. So I think Russia's emerging from this conflict in a much stronger place than it was before. And it's not just military strength, it's overall economic strength, economic potential, and the geopolitical positioning of Russia on the world stage.
Thanks, Scott. And thank you, Studio, for that very generous super chat. We have Herc Owen saying justice for Sonia Massey. Just hearing about this horrific police homicide, a black woman. This is these kind of things may heat up and may get more attention during this electoral silly season. Let's see, and let's see what people do. But Studio said again, if Yemen can get an aircraft carrier, they might bankrupt the military-industrial complex. They are quite talented at what they do.
I don't want them to get an aircraft carrier because on board that aircraft carrier are thousands of American citizens. I'd prefer that the American people bring that aircraft carrier home and stop playing stupid games out there, because the reality is, if we keep doing what we're doing, Yemen's going to get an aircraft carrier, and that's we don't want that. At least I don't want it. I mean, those people out there might be people out there that do want it, but as an American, I can never wish harm on my fellow service members,
especially if it's needless. You know, it's like this should, that they're not succeeding as it is. This isn't a it's not only is it not a successful military campaign, naval campaign that the U.S. is trying to wage on Yemen to try to break the blockade, but it only stands to get worse, and it doesn't stand to get better for the United States. And so, yeah, people will die. I remember at the beginning of the, after October 7th, I was with someone in Vietnam. I was with veterans. I was with Vets for Peace, and his son was actually deployed, to be on board those initial aircraft carriers that the U.S. was sending out there as like a show of, oh, well, maybe we'll get involved with Israel. And there's a lot of fear that the axis of resistance then would strike them, because, I mean, these are people who are in the military. They know that, you can mess around so much before, especially in a hot moment when Israel is literally threatening the annihilation and eventually has been carrying out that annihilation of entire people, you might end up catching those strays if you support that. This is something that I think that's very real on the Red Sea too. Now we have Pirate Smurf. Nice name. Your thoughts, maybe quickly, Scott, on the imprisonment of Imran Khan and his overthrow of the government in 2022, and what will happen to Pakistan if he is killed? Dark question.
Well, I mean, Imran Khan was a very popular, democratically elected prime minister. I'm not going to sit here and say that he wasn't corrupt. I'm not going to sit here and say that there weren't issues, because I just don't know. He's been accused of corruption. He's been accused of things. But what happened is that he didn't go along with the American decision to punish Russia because of Russia's invasion or the initiation of the special military operation against Ukraine. In fact, he was looking for Russian assistance in terms of oil. I don't want to get too much into it, balance of payments, having foreign currency reserves on hand capable of paying off the debt. There's a lot of problems for that. And so he went over there and he came back, and there was a vote of no confidence that was orchestrated by the United States. And Imran Khan said so. He said, America did this. And of course, America and everybody else going, no, we didn't. That's conspiracy theory and all this stuff. Turns out that America did do that. And there was a cable that proved it. And Imran Khan held the cable and made reference to it. And so now they charged him with the release of secrets. And then they now have charged him with improper marriage. Apparently they weren't divorced or separated or something long enough. The bottom line is, this is a man who, if there was free and democratic elections in Pakistan, would be the prime minister of Pakistan, because he's that popular still. Pakistan is a fundamentally broken nation. The military dominates it politically and economically. It's an unhealthy situation, but they can't have Imran Khan come back because he's now too powerful. If he does return as prime minister, he will break the back of those people who have orchestrated his arrest and his imprisonment. So, we're in a situation where they can't afford to let him out of prison. They can't allow him to return to politics. And unfortunately, Pakistan has a history of killing unpopular politicians. I hope that's not the case. he's done nothing that deserves the death sentence. But that's where we are right now. It's a very, very dangerous situation. But to pretend that Pakistan's a democracy when confronted by the reality of what they've done to undermine Imran Khan and to keep this man of the people out of the political processes, it proves the point that Pakistan's not a democracy.
And we have Woodley's feet in the UK, fan of yours, Scott. They have military experts in the United Kingdom. I mean, the United Kingdom has been saying a lot lately, Scott, about war, preparing for war with Russia, China, Iran by 2020. What is it, 7, 6? I don't know. We have military experts saying Hezbollah would beat them. Is it true? Very hard to believe.
Well, why is it hard to believe? Hezbollah has beaten Israel twice already. Hezbollah kicked Israel out of southern Lebanon. People tend to forget that. Hezbollah did that. Hezbollah defeated Israel in August 2006 when Israel initiated a major offensive designed to destroy Hezbollah. Hezbollah wasn't destroyed. They fought the Israeli army to a standstill and forced Israel to back away from, the pronouncements about the destruction of Hezbollah, etc. And Hezbollah is defeating Israel right now on the northern border in this war of attrition. Hezbollah has been preparing for a major conflict with Israel for some time now. The third, major drone overflight of Israel recently was done yesterday. Hezbollah released the footage, and it shows that Hezbollah, is able to fly a drone over Israel, the most secure sites of Israel that are supposed to have air defense, and apparently they don't, collect invaluable intelligence about the disposition of Israeli forces and the location of important targets. And then Hezbollah is sitting on 150,000 plus precision-guided rockets that can rain down on Israel and destroy. Hezbollah is prepared to take the fight to Israel. Israel has been planning a military operation, has Israeli forces going into southern Lebanon seeking to push Hezbollah back to the Litani River. That's not the fight Hezbollah is going to fight. Hezbollah is going to be sending troops under the ground, under tunnels, popping up in Israeli villages and towns, and seeking to seize northern Israel and the Galilee. That's the reality. That's called Hezbollah kicking Israel's butt. So it's not difficult to believe. Hezbollah has been kicking Israeli butt for decades now. Yeah,
you mentioned it earlier in the stream, this drone that they were able to conduct. I mean, the amount of intelligence that they took on the Ramat David Air Base, just right, just what is it, some 50, 60 kilometers away from the Lebanese border. Everything. They got everything. And they're showing it off to expose the fact that they know what they're doing, and they are equipped to take major, to land major hits if that's what the situation calls for. But as even the Western mainstream media is saying now, U.S. mainstream media too, saying, well, if Israel just comes to a ceasefire, all of this can at least go away for now. We can put a pause on the Hezbollah-Israel confrontation blowing up. So very interesting times. But I just want to thank D-Love, Speaking Truth to Give Peace a Chance, Studio Rainer. In the interest of time, I'm going to just thank all of you for additional super chats. But I think we're going to wrap it up here in the interest of time.
Can I answer one question that was in the chat?
Is it this one right here?
It wasn't a super chat one.
Okay. Well, thank you, Studio. I'll just put these up. Thank you, Speaking Truth. Thank you, D-Love. And then
but somebody asked the question. They said, did AIPAC ever approach me to try and buy me off? And the answer is yes, they did. It was a hell of an offer. It was done. When I first resigned from my position as a weapons inspector, I was welcomed with open arms by the pro-Israeli crowd, because I had 4 years of very close relationship with Israeli intelligence and things of that nature. And AIPAC just was trying to get me to speak at their convention. I didn't do it, but I was courted by the American Enterprise Institute, by the Washington Institute of Near East Studies, on and on and on and on. And I got a phone call from Paul Wolfowitz, who at the time was the dean of Johns Hopkins University School of Government, and he wanted to meet me. So we met at the Washington National Airport, and he said, "We have an offer. We being the collective." He said, "We're going to be running a candidate for president who's going to win the presidency. When that happens, you're in a position to be brought in at a fairly senior level in the Department of Defense or in the CIA. Your name is being bandied around, and we think you could do great things for that. But in the meantime, you have to earn a living. And so what we're proposing for you is that you go work at a think tank where you will get a base salary." And he said, "Don't worry, it's just a desk job. Just show up, write a couple papers, do a couple speaking, easy gig." He said, "Then we will have speaking engagements for you. These will be funded by APAC, and you'll be going around the country." And I think they were going to pay $30,000 per engagement with a guarantee of a minimum of 10 engagements a year. That's 300,000. A conservative publishing house was going to publish, give me, I think 3 titles, and they were going to pay significant advances for each title. But the bottom line is, when it all added up, basically over a 2-year period, I would be making between $3 and $6 million. That's a lot of money, especially when you're a broke ass former Marine who's not used to making more than $75,000 a year. And it was a hell of an offer. All I had to do was talk about Saddam Hussein not just being a criminal. I could have done that. I mean, I don't necessarily, today I don't believe that, but at the time, sure, why not? Bad guy. Saddam's a bad guy. I got it. But he had to be a bad guy possessing weapons of mass destruction. And I said, but he doesn't. He doesn't. I can't lie. He said, well, we don't want you to lie. We just want you to create the impression that he could have it. I said, but I just spent the last 7 years and I know he doesn't have it. I can't do it. And Wolfowitz was so pissed off at me. I mean, you're throwing your life away, da, 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 da. But that was the time when AIPAC and the pro-Israeli lobby tried to buy me off. It was a hell of a deal. And I oftentimes wonder what would have happened had I taken it. Had I sold my soul to the devil, where I'd be today, what golf courses I'd be playing at, what big house I'd have, the fact I wouldn't have any credit card debt. I wouldn't have any debt at all. It would be a wonderful life, except I'd have to look in the mirror and realize that I sold my soul for that. So anyways, I just saw that and I thought that maybe I should answer that and put a little interesting story out there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm sure you've got a lot of these interesting stories, Scott, that perhaps we can, you'll be back on here again, share more of. But it also gets me thinking about, as you were talking at that time period too, just how much Israel was invested in that narrative of weapons of mass destruction. I mean, Netanyahu himself, I understand your animosity toward it, Netanyahu, for many reasons, Scott, because I share those, but your personal also experience with that just a headwind of a moment for the U.S. in terms of its foreign policy, spreading that lie, having huge consequences for the planet, and Netanyahu being really a big part of that, as well as the Israeli government. That's just, I can't imagine. I was very young at the time, what it was like.
I wasn't that old at the time either.
Yeah, yeah.
You think about it, 1990, 1998.
Right.
And gosh, I was 37 years old. $6 million.
Yeah.
37 years old.
And your
What did
pride,
I do?
that's like,
What
yeah.
mistakes did I make? But oh
Right.
well. I can look in the mirror today and go, you may be poor, but you made the right choice.
Right. Well, everybody, we've been here for a while. So before we head out of here, do go to that video description. That's all the places where you can support this channel are there, from Patreon, Substack, Buy Me a Coffee, PayPal, and more. You also can find Scott Ritter's new book with Clarity Press on Ukraine. Scott, you said that there's something going on in New York. Do you want to plug anything before we go?
There's two things going on. I mean, book events are good. Selling books is good, but more important, getting the word out about the content in the book is good. On 4 August in New York City, at an undisclosed location, because the last time I tried to do something like this in New York City and I disclosed the location, the pro-Ukrainian crowd came in and put too much pressure on the hosts, and they canceled. But Randy Credico is honchoing this. If anybody wants to go, it's going to be at a fantastic location. We have a wonderful lineup there. The book will be available. I think you'd have to. I think it's $50, and you get the meal and the book and the event. That's what they're asking for. But if you want to do that, you can contact Randy Credico. I've posted that before. I should have it on my. There's no time to do it, but the information will get out there. If you check out my X or my Telegram, we've posted that information. Contact Randy. He can get you on the list to get in. There will be security because I'm on Ukrainian hit lists, and the Israelis hate me, and the Ukrainians hate me, and the U.S. government hates me. So we have to be concerned about who comes to this. But if you want to go and you can convince Randy Credico that you're not out to kill me, you can get in. On the 10th of August, I'll be speaking at Farmers and Chefs. That's a wonderful restaurant in Poughkeepsie, New York. And you can go to the Farmers and Chefs website. Again, it's you have to buy a ticket. The price of the ticket gets you a wonderful meal. And I have to tell you, this is a great restaurant. Dan Lechet is the owner and the chef. He's a fantastic, restaurateur. The meal is great. And as I said, the price of the ticket gets you the book. And I signed the book. I'll be answering questions, but it's just a pleasant evening. We did this with the Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika book, and it was just a wonderful event. We had like 70, 73, 75 people show up, and every one of them left, I think, empowered by the event. It was a great event. So Farmers and Chef on August 10th in Poughkeepsie, New York. Go to the website and you can get the tickets there. And then on August 4th, the Manhattan event, you have to go through Randy Credico to get that, but it'll be a good event. Like I said, we have some really interesting people coming to that as well. And Dan, I'd love it if you were one of the people, since you're in New York City, you were one of the people come. Let me know if you want to come, and I'll make sure that.
I definitely want to come to the 4th. I don't know if I'll be able to make Farmers and Chef, even though the food looks amazing, everything looks amazing. Yeah. But I definitely want to come on the 4th. So let's definitely be in touch.
Absolutely.
Privately, and we can work that. I think I just looked at the schedule. I always have to go around my wife's schedule weekends with the dog. But that's like. But it looks like it's gonna be I can finagle it. Probably, I don't see why not. Yeah, well, there you go. Farmers and Chefs. I put it on the website. I put it in the chat. Go to scottritter.com. Go to his Telegram. You can find all that on scottritter.com, so you can reach out to him regarding the other event on August 4th in New York. But all that said, everyone, thank you so much. Tomorrow I am live again, actually 8:30 p.m. Eastern, with Ben Norton of Geopolitical Economy Report, Lee Camp of Dangerous Ideas. We will pick it up where we left off here. So 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. See you tomorrow night, July 25th. Bye-bye, everybody.